The last time my father looked me in the eyes, he told me my daughter was not worth investing in. 12 years later, that average girl stepped off a helicopter onto his lawn, and everyone went quiet for the wrong reason. She did not come back to beg. She came back holding paperwork that made my brother's hands shake. And before the day ended, my parents finally learned what gifted really costs. My name is Paisley Hughes. I am 49 years old, and for the first 37 years of my life, I was invisible. In the Hughes family, you are born into one of two categories. You are either a son, which makes you a king, or you are a daughter, which makes you a footnote. I spent decades trying to write myself into the main text of this family's history, only to be edited out every single time. But today is different. Today, the ink is permanent. I stood on the edge of the manicured fescue lawn of the estate just outside Annapolis, Maryland. It was the same lawn where I scraped my knees as a child trying to get my father to look up from his newspaper. It was the same lawn where my brother, Bryce, used to tackle me into the dirt while my mother laughed and told me to stop being so dramatic. And it was the exact same patch of grass where, 12 years ago, my father pointed a shaking finger at the gate and told me to take my failure of a daughter and get out of his sight. The air was thick with the humidity of the Chesapeake Bay and the scent of expensive charcoal. My parents were hosting what they called a reconciliation gala. Though we all knew it was just a stage play, they needed an audience to witness their generosity. They needed to show the neighbors that the Hughes dynasty was still intact, still powerful, still golden. I held a plastic cup of lukewarm iced tea. Watching them, my father, Walter Hughes, sat at the head of the long outdoor table like a monarch holding court. He looked frail now, oxygen tubes trailing from his nose like a leash, but his eyes were still hard. He was looking at Bryce, his golden boy. With a mixture of desperation and pride, Bryce was laughing too loud at a joke that was not funny. His wife was checking her reflection in a spoon. My younger sister, Tessa, was hovering near the buffet, trying to make herself small, trying to be useful, trying to disappear so she would not be criticized. It was a perfect tableau of dysfunction painted in beige and navy blue. Then the vibration started. It began as a low thrum in the chest, something you felt before you heard. The water in my plastic cup began to ripple, sending tiny concentric circles from the center to the rim. The conversation at the main table faltered. My mother looked up, shielding her eyes against the midday sun. The thrum deepened into a rhythmic pounding, a percussive beat that seemed to sync with my own heart rate. Thwoop, thwoop, thwoop. The wind picked up instantly. The white linen napkins on the tables whipped up like surrender flags. A decorative vase of hydrangeas toppled over. Shattering on the patio stones, the noise became deafening. A roaring mechanical beast descending from the clouds. The guests scrambled, clutching their hats and their plates, their polite society masks slipping off to reveal annoyance and fear. I did not move. I just watched my father. Walter Hughes griped the arms of his wheelchair. His face went through a complex series of contortions. First, confusion, then, irritation, and finally, a distinct, sharp flash of fear. He looked angry, not because of the noise, but because someone was interrupting him. Someone was daring to be louder than him, to Walter Hughes. Making a scene was a sin, unless he was the one making it. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on me for a split second. He looked at me as if I had hired a clown for a funeral. He looked at me with that familiar disdain, the look that said I was embarrassing him just by existing. But the helicopter was not a clown car. It was a sleek, black executive machine, the kind that costs more per hour to operate than my father used to pay me in a year. It banked sharply over the water and began its descent right onto the center of the lawn, the rotor wash flattening the prize-winning rose bushes my mother loved more than her children. The engine whined down as the skids touched the grass. The blades slowed to a lazy, dangerous swoosh. The door opened. If you think my daughter came back to exact some petty revenge, like buying the family estate just to evict them, you are guessing too small. You are thinking in terms of real estate. My daughter was thinking in terms of empires. I looked down at my wrist. I was wearing a small, battered analog watch with a leather strap that had been replaced 3 times. It belonged to my grandmother, Evelyn. It was small, understated, and ticked with a hiccup every minute. My father hated this watch. He used to tell me it was the cheap junk of a failure, a symbol of a woman who never knew her place. He told me to throw it away and get something that looked like success. I kept it. I wore it to every shift at the hospital. I wore it when I signed the lease on my first tiny apartment, and I was wearing it now as the dust settled on the lawn. If you have ever been judged by your gender, if you have ever been told you are too emotional to lead or too soft to negotiate, I want you to stay right here, because what my daughter brought with her today was not a weapon, it was not a lawsuit, it was something much heavier. Sophie stepped out of the helicopter. She was dressed in a tailored suit that fit her like armor. She did not look at the ground to watch her step. She looked straight at the table where the family sat frozen. The silence that followed the engine shutdown was absolute. It was the kind of silence that hurts your ears. Sophie did not smile. She did not wave. She walked across the grass with a stride that ate up the distance between the past and the present. In her hand, she held a thick black folder. I looked at my brother, Bryce, the golden boy, the savior, the genius. His face had drained of all color. His hands, resting on the white tablecloth, were shaking so bad he had to clasp them together to stop the tremors. He knew, somehow, in the way a prey animal knows the predator has entered the clearing, he knew what was in that folder. My parents were quiet for the wrong reason. They thought she was showing off. They thought this was a display of new money, a vulgar entrance meant to impress them. They did not understand that she had not come to impress them. She had come to collect. Walter opened his mouth to speak, to bark a command, to demand an explanation for the ruined roses. But the words died in his throat when Sophie stopped 5 feet from him. She placed the black folder on the table. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. She had returned to the place where she was once called a bad investment. She had returned to the people who said she would never amount to anything more than a housewife. And she had brought the receipts. But to understand why my brother looks like he's about to vomit, and why my father looks like he is seeing a ghost, we cannot start here. We cannot start at the victory lap. We have to go back to the moment the war began. We have to go back 12 years, to the day they tried to steal the only thing I had to give her. We have to go back to the day they decided my daughter was worth $0.00. The house my father built his identity around sat on a hill that looked down on everything else in the county. It was a colonial brick fortress that smelled permanently of lemon oil and old dust. To the outside world, it was a mansion that signaled generational wealth. To me, it was a museum where I was allowed to visit, but never allowed to touch the exhibits. The architecture itself was designed to make you feel small. The ceilings were too high, the hallways were too wide, and the shadows always seemed to stretch a little longer than they should. When you walked down the main corridor, you had to pass the Wall of Achievements. It was a shrine dedicated entirely to the male line of the Hughes family. There were framed photographs of my father shaking hands with senators. There were photos of my brother, Bryce, holding baseball trophies, Bryce graduating from prep school, Bryce wearing his first suit. There were no pictures of me receiving my nursing degree. There were no pictures of my younger sister, Tessa, winning her debate championships. In the visual history of this house, the women were ghosts. We were there to maintain the background, to dust the frames, but never to be inside them. The dining room was the heart of the dysfunction. At the head of the table sat a massive mahogany chair with high armrests and clawed feet. It was the only chair with armrests. It was my father's throne. No one else was ever permitted to sit in it, even when he was not in the room. To the immediate right of that throne was Bryce's chair. It was always pulled uncomfortably close to father, creating a physical unit of power that excluded the rest of us. My mother, Tessa, and I sat on the other chairs, the ones with low backs and flat cushions, designed to keep you upright and alert, never relaxed. I was the eldest child. But in the Hughes calculus, being a firstborn daughter is merely a practice run. I was capable. I was sharp. I managed high-stress situations every single day at Redwood Bay Medical Pavilion. I worked 12-hour shifts in an emergency unit where decisions had to be made in seconds and mistakes cost lives. I paid my own mortgage. I changed my own tires. I lived a life of practical, hard-won independence. But to Walter Hughes, I was just a worker bee. He called my job undignified. He asked why I settled for wiping floors when I could have married a doctor instead of working alongside them. He did not understand that I liked the blood and the adrenaline because it was the only place where I was judged solely on my competence, not my gender. Then there was the next generation. This was where the knife twisted the deepest. My brother Bryce had a son named Landon. From the moment Landon took his first breath, he was anointed as the savior of the family name. Landon was not a child. He was an investment vehicle. He had math tutors at age 4. He had violin lessons at age 5. He was enrolled in a feeder school that cost more per semester than I earned in a year. The family narrative was that Landon was a genius, a prodigy who would elevate the Hughes legacy to national prominence if Landon got a C on a test. It was the teacher's fault. If Landon threw a tantrum, it was just his high-strung intellect expressing itself. My daughter, Sophie, was different. Sophie was quiet. She had wild curly hair and eyes that observed everything but revealed nothing. She was a solid student, bringing home report cards full of B's and the occasional A, but she was not a prodigy. She liked to draw. She liked to read books about weather patterns and ocean tides. She was kind. She would share her lunch with kids who forgot theirs. In my house, kindness was viewed as a defect. It was seen as a lack of ambition. My parents looked at Sophie and saw a dead end. I remember a Sunday dinner when Sophie was 10. She was excitedly telling her grandfather about a science project she was working on. My father cut her off mid-sentence to ask Bryce how Landon's coding camp was going. When I confronted him later in the kitchen, his answer was chillingly pragmatic. He told me that girls like Sophie were sweet, but they were temporary. He said she would grow up, change her last name, and belong to some other man's family. He asked me why he should pour resources into a vessel that was just going to sail away to another port. He called her a bad return on investment. That was the atmosphere we breathed. Oxygen was reserved for the men. The women were expected to survive on carbon dioxide. My sister Tessa learned to survive by becoming a chameleon. She agreed with everything Father said. She laughed at Bryce's cruel jokes. She became a hollow echo of the men in charge, hoping that if she made herself small enough, they would keep protecting her. I chose the opposite path. I became rigid. I became cold. I stopped seeking their approval and started building a fortress around myself and my daughter. But I had one ally, my grandmother, Evelyn Hart. Evelyn was my mother's mother, a woman who had married into money but never let the money own her. She was the only person who sat in my father's house and did not flinch when he raised his voice. She was the one who bought Sophie sketch pads instead of etiquette books. She was the one who told me that my job at Redwood Bay Medical Pavilion was noble work. When Evelyn died, the family mourned the loss of her assets, not her presence. They circled like vultures waiting for the will reading. But Evelyn was smarter than they gave her credit for. She left small, token amounts to everyone. Enough to be polite, but not enough to change anyone's life. But for Sophie, she did something different. She left a trust. It was not a mountain of cash that could be raided. It was a specific, locked fund designated strictly for education. But there was a secret layer to it, one that I did not fully understand until I read the fine print in the safety of my own small apartment. Evelyn had not just left money. She had created a legal ironclad structure. She had appointed an independent trustee who hated my father, and she had included a clause that said the funds could never, under any circumstances, be commingled with family assets or accessed by anyone other than Sophie or her legal guardian for direct educational expenses. Evelyn had whispered to me in her final days. She gripped my hand with surprising strength, her blue veins prominent against her paper-thin skin. She told me to never put Sophie's future on the negotiating table. She told me that they would try to take it, She said that men like my father and brother believe everything in the world belongs to them by divine right, and they view anything they cannot control as a theft. I held on to that secret like a grenade in my pocket. I went to work. I drove my 10-year-old sedan. I wore my scrubs. I listened to Bryce brag about his new luxury SUV and his country club membership. I watched Landon get showered with the latest tablets and designer clothes while Sophie wore hand-me-downs. I watched my father sit in his throne, looking at his grandson with the eyes of a man betting on a racehorse. They thought we were weak because we were silent. They thought we were poor because we were not flashy. They did not know that the quiet little girl drawing in the corner had a safety net woven from steel, and they did not know that I was ready to burn the whole house down before I let them cut a single string of it. The tension in the house was physical. You could feel it in the way the silverware clinked against the china. It was the sound of a family that was not held together by love, but by a shared delusion of grandeur. And delusions are expensive. They cost money to maintain. I did not know it yet, but the bill was coming due. The cracks in the foundation were already there, hidden behind the expensive wallpaper and the wall of portraits. Bryce's laugh was getting a little too loud. My father's lectures on fiscal responsibility were getting a little too aggressive. The predator was hungry, and it was starting to look around the room for something easy to eat. They looked at Sophie and saw a meal. They had no idea she was poison. The acceptance letter did not come in a thin envelope like they used to warn us about in high school movies. It arrived digitally, a burst of pixels that set the entire Hughes household on fire. Landon had been accepted into a premier engineering program, the kind of institution where the name on the diploma opens doors before you even knock. It was the Ivy League validation my father had been craving like a drug for the last 2 decades. When I arrived at the house that afternoon, the atmosphere was hysterical. It felt less like a celebration of a teenager's academic achievement and more like a coronation ceremony for a minor deity. My mother was already on her 3rd glass of champagne. Her cheeks flushed a dangerous shade of pink. She was on the phone with a caterer, ordering hors d'oeuvres for a party that had not even been scheduled yet, shouting about how her grandson was going to change the world. My father sat in his living room, clutching a printed copy of the acceptance email. His hands were trembling, but for the first time in years, it was not from age or infirmity, it was from sheer, unadulterated triumph. He looked up at me as I walked in, his eyes wet with tears. He told me that the Hughes name was finally back where it belonged. He said that history would remember this day. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask where Sophie was. He just kept staring at that piece of paper as if it were a treaty ending a war he had been fighting in his own head. But amidst the popping corks and the self-congratulatory toasts, there was a frequency that felt wrong. It was a high-pitched whine of panic that only a dog or a desperate sibling could hear. I watched my brother, Bryce. He was pacing the length of the oriental rug, laughing too loudly at things that were not jokes. He clapped Landon on the back with enough force to make the boy stumble. He kept repeating phrases like, "top of the line," and "only the best for my boy," but his eyes were darting around the room, checking the corners, checking the exits. It was the behavior of a man who knows the walls are closing in. When the topic of tuition came up, the air in the room grew instantly heavy. We all knew the numbers: tuition, room, board, and the lifestyle Bryce insisted Landon needed would cost upwards of $80,000 a year. That was over $300,000 for a 4-year degree, assuming he finished on time. My mother chirped that money was no object for genius. Bryce gave a sharp, barking laugh and said, of course it was handled. Of course the funds were there. But he did not say where the funds were. He did not mention a savings account or a 529 plan. He just kept saying we would figure it out. And every time he said we, his eyes slid over to me for a fraction of a second before darting away. They were not celebrating. They were hunting. And they were looking for a carcass to feed the beast. I left the party early, claiming a headache. The truth was that the smell of desperation was making me nauseous. I drove back to my small apartment on the other side of town, the silence of the car a welcome relief from the manic energy of the Hughes estate. When I got home, I went straight to the bedroom and pulled the fireproof lockbox from under my bed. My hands were steady, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. I dialed the combination. Click, click, click. The lid popped open with a heavy thud. Inside lay the paperwork my grandmother Evelyn had entrusted to me. The paper was thick, creamy, and smelled faintly of lavender and old ink. I picked up the main document, the trust agreement. I had read it 100 times, but tonight I read it differently. I read it with the eyes of a woman who knew a siege was coming. Evelyn had been brilliant. She had known that my father viewed money as a tool for control. And she had known that Bryce viewed money as a magic trick that never ended. She had anticipated this exact moment. The trust was not just a pot of money, it was a fortress. First, there was the independent trustee. The funds were managed by a law firm in downtown Baltimore that had no ties to the Hughes family. My father could not bully them, Bryce could not charm them. They answered only to the document. But then there was the second layer, the one I had almost forgotten about. It was a clause buried on page 14. It stated that the funds were protected by a spendthrift provision so strict that no creditor, family member, or legal entity could touch the principal for any reason other than the direct educational expenses of the named beneficiary. And here was the kicker. If anyone attempted to contest the trust or force a distribution for other purposes, the trustee was authorized to freeze the assets entirely until Sophie turned 25. It was a poison pill. Evelyn had rigged the game so that if they tried to steal the money would simply vanish into a vault until they were all dead or irrelevant. I heard a soft footstep in the doorway. I looked up to see Sophie standing there. She was wearing oversized pajamas, her hair a tangle of curls. She looked younger than 17 in the dim light, but her eyes were old. She looked at the open box, then at the papers spread out on my duvet. She asked me quietly if they were going to ask for her money. The question hit me like a physical blow. There was no whine in her voice, no childish unfairness, just a flat resignation to the facts. She knew. She had sat at those dinners. She had heard the comments. She knew that in the eyes of her grandfather and uncle, her future was just fuel for Landon's rocket ship. I wanted to lie to her. I wanted to tell her that family protects each other, that they would never stoop so low. But I had promised myself I would never be like them. I would never build a reality on a foundation of lies. I told her yes. I told her that tomorrow, at the emergency family meeting they had summoned us to, they were going to ask us to hand over her inheritance. Sophie walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. She touched the corner of the grandmother's will. She did not cry. She just nodded, as if confirming a hypothesis she had been working on for years. Then I made a decision that scared me more than the meeting itself. I told Sophie she was coming with me. Usually, I shielded her. I invented excuses for why we could not stay for dessert. I absorbed the insults so she would not hear them, but she was almost an adult now. She needed to see who these people really were. She needed to see the monster without its mask. If I kept protecting her from the truth, she might spend her life wondering if she had misunderstood them. I needed her to see the greed in their eyes, so she would never, ever be tempted to seek their validation again. The next morning, the drive to my parents' house felt like a funeral procession. The sky was a bruised purple, threatening rain. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. The leather grip felt slippery, unreliable. I looked over at Sophie in the passenger seat. She was looking out the window, her jaw set tight. She looked terrified, but she also looked resolved. We were not driving to a family dinner. We were driving to a trial. The verdict had already been decided in their heads. They had already spent the money, already planned the victory tour. All they needed now was for the defendant to plead guilty and hand over the keys to the vault. I turned into the long driveway. The gravel crunched under the tires, a sound that always reminded me of bones breaking. I parked behind Bryce's car. It was a new model, shiny and black, likely leased on credit he did not have. I turned off the engine. The silence in the car was heavy. I reached over and squeezed Sophie's hand. I told her to remember one thing. I told her that no matter what they said in that room, no matter how much they yelled or cried or threatened, the paper in my bag was stronger than their blood. We stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. The house loomed over us, tall and imposing, a monument to a legacy that was rotting from the inside out. I could see the silhouette of my father in the window, watching us come. He was waiting. I took a breath that tasted of ozone and fear. I pushed the door open. My father did not offer us a seat. He did not ask if we wanted water or tea. He did not ask Sophie how her final exams were going or ask me about the long shifts at the hospital. He simply sat in his high-backed mahogany chair, his hands clasped on the table like a judge holding a gavel, and waited for the room to settle into a terrified silence. The air smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive, heavy cologne. It was the smell of a room where deals were made and sentences were passed. "Family requires sacrifice," he said. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at a spot on the wall just above my head, as if addressing a spirit of the house rather than his own daughter. He started talking about the Hughes legacy. He spoke about how rare true genius is, and how it is the duty of the ordinary members of a bloodline to support the extraordinary ones. He used words like destiny and history. He built a verbal monument to his grandson, painting Landon not as a teenager who got into a good school, but as a national asset that needed to be preserved. Then his eyes snapped down and locked onto mine. The vagueness vanished. The philosophy evaporated. "Paisley," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly command. "The education fund that your grandmother left for Sophie, we need it." I felt Sophie stiffen beside me. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on my father. "It is not available," I said. Bryce leaned forward. He was sweating. I could see the damp patches on his dress shirt under the armpits. He put on a smile that was meant to be charming but looked like a rictus of panic. "Come on, Paisley," Bryce said. "Let us be adults here. You are the practical one. You have always been the realist. We are not asking for a gift. We are talking about a reallocation of resources. Landon needs the first year covered. Just the first year. Once he is settled, once the alumni network kicks in, I will pay you back. I will write you a promissory note." I looked at my brother. This was a man who had leased 3 different luxury cars in 2 years and was currently dodging calls from his country club about overdue dues. A promissory note from Bryce was worth less than the napkin under his drink. "It is Sophie's money," I said. "It is for her education." Tessa let out a short, sharp laugh from the other side of the room. She was swirling a glass of red wine, leaning against the sideboard like a bored spectator at a dogfight. "Oh, please," Tessa said. She took a sip of wine, her eyes glittering with malice. "Let us be real. Paisley, Sophie is going to go to a state school, maybe even community college. She does not need a private trust for that. She can take out loans like normal people. Why should she sit on a pile of cash she does not need when Landon actually has a future to pay for?" The insult was precise. It was designed to hurt Sophie, to make her feel small so she would volunteer the money just to stop the pain. I felt a heat rising in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "My daughter is going to college," I said, my voice steady but cold, "and she is going to graduate without debt. That is what Grandmother Evelyn wanted." My father slammed his hand on the table. The silverware jumped. Evelyn was a soft-hearted old woman who did not understand strategy. He shouted, "And you are being selfish. You are holding back the entire family for the sake of one average girl." He pointed a shaking finger at Sophie. "Look at her. Paisley. She is a side branch. She will get married. She will change her name. And she will be someone else's problem. You do not invest capital in a side branch. You invest in the trunk. You invest in the name." The room went deadly quiet. The misogyny was naked, stripped of any polite euphemisms. He had just told my daughter to her face that she was a bad investment because she was female. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him exactly what I thought of his trunk and his name. But Tessa moved first. She pushed off the sideboard and walked toward me. She looked unstable, her movements jerky, as she passed me. She stumbled. It was a theatrical, poorly acted stumble. Her hand jerked forward, and the contents of her wineglass splashed across the front of my white blouse. The dark red liquid soaked into the fabric instantly, spreading like a fresh wound across my chest and stomach. It was cold and sticky. "Oops," Tessa said. She did not sound sorry. She sounded delighted. She covered her mouth with a hand that was perfectly manicured. "I am so sorry. Paisley," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You really should not have been standing there. But you know how you are. You always make a mess of things. You always make everything so dramatic." She looked at Bryce, and he smirked. She looked at my father, and he did not even blink. He just watched the wine drip from my shirt onto his expensive rug with a look of mild annoyance. No one offered me a towel. No one asked if I was okay. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence of complicity. They were enjoying this. They wanted to see me humiliated. They wanted to see me broken, wet, and stained, so that I would just give them what they wanted to make it stop. My father leaned back in his throne. "Here is the situation. Paisley," he said, "you have two choices. You transfer the control of that fund to Bryce by tomorrow morning, or you leave this house and you do not come back. You are done. You are out of the family. No inheritance, no support, no contact." He looked at me with eyes that were completely void of love. "Make a choice," he said. I looked down at the wine stain on my chest. I felt the cold wetness against my skin. And then, strangely, I felt calm. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. The little girl inside me who just wanted her daddy to love her finally died, and in her place stood a mother who had a job to do. I looked up. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not give them the reaction they were hungry for. "I cannot give you the money," I said. My father's face turned purple. "You ungrateful little—" I cut him off. My voice was quiet, hard, and precise. "I cannot give it to you," I repeated, not because I do not want to, although I certainly do not. "I cannot give it to you because I do not have the legal authority to withdraw it." Bryce frowned. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "You are the guardian. Just sign the check." I shook my head. "Grandmother Evelyn knew you." "Bryce," I said, "she knew all of you. That is why she did not just leave money. She left an irrevocable trust." I saw the word land on Bryce like a physical blow. Irrevocable. He knew what that meant. "There is an independent trustee," I continued, enjoying the way the color was draining from his face. "A lawyer in Baltimore. He has sole discretion over the funds. The money can only be released directly to an accredited educational institution for tuition and books. It cannot be withdrawn for cash. It cannot be transferred to another family member, and it certainly cannot be used to pay for a lifestyle." I looked at my father. "If I tried to withdraw that money for you, the trustee would freeze the account. If you try to sue for it, the trust pays for its own legal defense until the money is gone." Evelyn locked it down. "Father," she locked it down because she knew this day would come. The silence now was different. It was not the silence of judgment. It was the silence of shock. They had not just lost a negotiation. They had been outmaneuvered by a dead woman they had underestimated for 50 years. Bryce slumped in his chair. He looked sick. He looked like a man who had already spent the money in his head and was now realizing the check was going to bounce. "You are lying," Tessa hissed, though she looked unsure. "I am not lying," I said, "and you know I am not, because you know exactly how smart grandmother was." I reached out and took Sophie's hand. Her palm was sweaty, but her grip was strong. She was looking at them, her eyes wide, seeing them clearly for the first time. She saw the greed. She saw the cruelty. She saw the pathetic, grasping nature of the people who were supposed to be her heroes. I turned to my father. "You said I had to choose." I said, "I choose my daughter." I pulled Sophie toward the door. We walked past Tessa, who was still holding her empty wineglass. We walked past Bryce, who was staring at the table as if he could will the money into existence. We walked past my father, who was gasping for air, his face twisted in a rictus of impotent rage. We walked out of the front door and into the gray afternoon. The air outside tasted clean. As we reached the car, I stopped and turned to Sophie. I did not wipe the wine off my shirt. I wanted her to see it. I wanted her to remember it. "Listen to me," I said. She looked up at me. "From this moment on," I told her, "family is not the people who share your blood. Family is the people who protect you. And those people in there, they are not your family anymore. They are just people who wanted to rob you." I opened the car door for her. "Let us go home," I said, and as I drove away, leaving the brick mansion in the rearview mirror, I did not feel a sense of loss. I felt lighter. I had lost a family. Yes, but I had saved my daughter, and that was a trade I would make every single day for the rest of my life. The silence from the Hughes estate was instantaneous and absolute. There were no angry phone calls at midnight, no letters of demand, and no guilt-tripping text messages. It was as if we had been surgically removed from the family organism. Christmas came and went without a card. Birthdays passed without acknowledgement. To my father and brother, we were not just estranged relatives. We were dead limbs that had been severed to save the tree. We simply ceased to exist in their version of reality. For the first few months, the quiet felt heavy, like we were waiting for the other shoe to drop, but eventually, the silence transformed into something else. It became oxygen. My life shrank down to the essentials. I took every shift available at Redwood Bay Medical Pavilion. I worked nights. I worked weekends. I volunteered for the holidays that paid time and a half. Thanksgiving was not a time for turkey. It was a time for double pay. My social life became the rhythm of the vital signs monitor and the squeak of rubber shoes on linoleum. I learned to sleep in 4-hour bursts. I learned which grocery stores marked down their produce on Tuesday nights and which gas stations were 3 cents cheaper per gallon. We were poor. There is no romantic way to say it. When the water heater broke, we heated water on the stove for baths for 3 weeks because I did not have the $400 for the repair part. Dinner was a rotation of the holy trinity of poverty: pasta, beans, and rice. We ate a lot of eggs. We drank tap water. But here's the thing about that poverty. It was peaceful. When we sat down to our bowls of cheap noodles at our scratched kitchen table, no one was criticizing Sophie's posture. No one was making snide remarks about my job. No one was comparing us to a cousin who had just made the dean's list. The air in our small apartment was stale. Perhaps, but it was ours. We paid for it with our own sweat, so nobody could tell us how to breathe in it. Sophie enrolled in the local community college. It was not the Ivy League. The campus was a collection of beige concrete buildings next to a strip mall. She took the bus every morning at 6 o'clock because we could not afford a second car. She worked part-time at a library, shelving books for minimum wage, and then she came home and studied at the kitchen table while I got ready for the night shift. One rainy Tuesday in November, about 2 years into our exile, I came home to find Sophie staring at a stack of bills I had left on the counter. We were short on the electric bill again. She looked up at me, her eyes tired. She asked me if I regretted it. She asked if I ever wished we had just given them the money so we could live comfortably. I sat down across from her. I did not lie to her. I told her that yes, sometimes I did regret it. I told her that when I was scraping ice off my windshield at 5 in the morning, or when I had to put back a block of cheese at the store because it was too expensive, I thought about how easy life used to be. But then, I told her the rest of the truth. I told her I did not regret standing by her. I told her that comfort purchased with her dignity was too expensive. She nodded, and that was the last time we ever spoke about going back. Over the years, news from the Hughes empire drifted down to us like ash from a distant fire. We did not seek it out, but Annapolis is a small town in certain circles, and gossip has a way of finding you. I heard that Bryce was cycling through cars like he was trying to outrun a repo man. He traded the luxury SUV for a sports car, then the sports car for a sedan, and then the sedan for something even smaller. The neighbors whispered that the maintenance on the big house was slipping, The landscaping was not quite as sharp. The paint was peeling on the south side. My father's health was deteriorating, his lungs giving up on him, tethering him closer and closer to his oxygen tank. But the most tragic news was about Landon. The golden boy, the investment vehicle, the savior of the line. It turned out that you cannot program a human being like a computer. Landon did not conquer the Ivy League. He survived his freshman year by the skin of his teeth, and then the cracks started to show. The pressure to be a genius, to carry the weight of his grandfather's ego and his father's debts, broke him. He switched majors 3 times. He took a leave of absence for health reasons that everyone knew meant a mental breakdown. He eventually graduated, but without honors, without the fanfare, and without the high-paying job at a top firm that Bryce had banked on. He moved back home, drifting between vague consulting gigs that Bryce set up for him. He was a young man with a hollow look in his eyes, crushed by the expectation that he was supposed to be extraordinary when he was simply perfectly normal. I did not feel happy when I heard this. I did not feel vindicated. I just felt tired. I felt a deep, aching sadness for a nephew I was not allowed to know. They had sacrificed my daughter to feed his future, and in the end, they had devoured him too. While the House of Hughes was slowly sinking under the weight of its own pretensions, Sophie was building something in the dark. She did not have tutors. She did not have connections. She had a second-hand laptop and the internet, while her peers at the community college were partying. Sophie was on forums. She was taking free coding courses from MIT and Stanford that were posted online. She was teaching herself data analytics, meteorology modeling, and Python script. She became obsessed with data. She would sit for hours looking at spreadsheets, finding patterns in chaos. It was not something she did for a grade. It was something she did because she was hungry. She realized that the world was full of noise, and the people who could filter that noise were the ones who held the real power. I would come home at 3 a.m. and see the light under her door. I would peek in and see her asleep with her face on the keyboard, lines of code still running on the screen. She was working twice as hard to get half as far, and she never complained once. We were the underdogs. We were the people the world forgets. But there is a power in being forgotten. When no one is watching you, you can make mistakes without being ridiculed. When no one expects you to save the family name, you are free to figure out who you actually are. One evening, after she had transferred to a state university on a full academic scholarship, earned, not bought, she closed her laptop and looked at me. She had just finished a project that I did not understand. Something about predictive algorithms for flood zones. She told me that she did not need them to tell her she was good enough. She said she did not care if grandfather ever acknowledged her success. She looked me dead in the eye and said the words that I have carried in my heart ever since. She said she did not need their recognition. She just needed to make sure that she did not turn around one day and realize she had become a smaller version of them. That was the moment I knew we had won. We did not have the money yet. We did not have the fame. But we had something they lost a long time ago. We had our souls intact. And as it turned out, that was the foundation Sophie needed to build an empire that would eventually cast a shadow over everything they owned. Sophie graduated into a job market that did not care about her last name. She landed a position at a small logistics firm doing Tier 1 technical support. It was the kind of job that grinds the soul down to a fine powder. She spent 8 hours a day in a cubicle the size of a closet, wearing a headset, telling frustrated truck drivers how to reset their passwords. The pay was $42,000 a year. In the economy we were living in, that was enough to keep the lights on and the refrigerator stocked with store-brand yogurt, but it was not enough to dream on. But Sophie did not use her evenings to recover. She used them to attack. While I was asleep after my shifts at the hospital, Sophie was in the living room of our cramped apartment, building a second life. She treated knowledge like it was something she had to inhale before the air ran out. She taught herself Python and R. She downloaded massive open-source datasets on climate patterns and urban topography. I would wake up at 2 in the morning to get a glass of water and find her surrounded by 3 monitors she had scavenged from thrift stores. Her face illuminated by the blue glow of complex topographical maps. She was not just coding. She was looking for a pattern in the chaos. Living near the Chesapeake Bay, we were used to the water rising. Every time a major storm hit, the basements flooded, the roads closed, and the city infrastructure crumbled. People called it an act of God. Sophie called it a data inefficiency. She entered a regional competition for urban resilience. Her pitch was a predictive modeling system that could forecast microfloods down to the specific street corner 48 hours in advance, allowing emergency services to reroute before the water even touched the pavement. She worked on it for 4 months straight. She barely ate. She poured everything she had into that presentation. She lost. She did not just lose, she was dismissed. The judges were older men with degrees on their walls and skepticism in their eyes. They told her the scope was too broad. They told her she lacked the institutional backing to manage that kind of data flow. One of them actually asked her if she had had help from a professor, implying she could not possibly have built the algorithm herself. I waited for her to crash. I waited for the tears, the anger, the feeling of worthlessness that used to consume Landon whenever he got a B on a test. Sophie came home, took off her blazer, and sat on the couch. She looked tired, but her eyes were dry. They did not like the interface. She said calmly, "And they think the data processing is too slow." I asked her if she was hurt. She looked at me and shrugged. They criticized the product. "Mom," she said, "they did not criticize me. The product can be fixed." That was the moment I realized my daughter was dangerous. She had separated her ego from her work. My family had spent their lives trying to prove they were special, so every failure felt like a death sentence. Sophie knew she was just a person doing a job. So every failure was just data. It was just feedback. A week later, she got an email from one of the people who had been in the back of the room during her pitch. He was a retired civil engineer who had seen thousands of flashy presentations. He told her that her model was rough, but her logic was sound. He told her that she lacked funding and polish, but she had the one thing that could not be taught. She had discipline, with that tiny spark of validation. Sophie quit her job. It was terrifying. We were living paycheck to paycheck, and suddenly, half our income was gone. She registered a limited liability company called Bay Shield Analytics. The headquarters was our dining table. The server room was a stack of humming black boxes pushed against the wall next to the radiator. For the first 6 months, we bled. Sophie took freelance coding gigs to pay the internet bill. I picked up extra shifts at the pavilion, working until my feet felt like they were fused to my shoes. We were tired. We were scared. There was a week where we had exactly $12 in the checking account and rent was due in 3 days. Then came the contract that almost killed us. Sophie had negotiated a pilot program with a mid-sized county municipality. It was a small deal, only $15,000, but it was the proof of concept she needed. She spent weeks tailoring the software to their grid. She worked through the night after night, fueled by caffeine and sheer will. On the day of the signing, the county manager called. He was sorry. The budget had been cut. They were pulling the plug. I watched Sophie put the phone down. Her hand was shaking. For the first time in years, I saw the fear break through. We had spent money we did not have on server capacity for this client. Without that check, we were not just broke, we were insolvent. I sat with her in the silence. The hum of the servers sounded like a countdown. "We have to shut it down," she whispered. "We cannot afford the electricity." I wanted to comfort her. I wanted to tell her it was okay to quit. But then I remembered the lockbox. I went to my bedroom and pulled out the fireproof box. I had not looked at the papers in years, not since the day we walked out of the mansion. I dug past the main trust documents, the ones we could not touch, and found a smaller, thinner envelope at the bottom. It was labeled simply, "For the rainy day." I opened it. Inside were bond certificates. Grandmother Evelyn had been a woman of layers. The main trust was the fortress, locked tight. But she had hidden a small, liquid asset in the back of the file, a bearer bond that matured on Sophie's 21st birthday. We had missed the date because we were too busy surviving. It was not a fortune. It was $25,000. To my father, that was a weekend trip to the Hamptons. To us, it was a lifeline. I walked back into the living room and placed the papers on top of Sophie's laptop. She looked at the number. She looked at me. Grandmother Evelyn knew you would need a push. I said, she did not want to give you a cushion to sleep on. She wanted to give you a ladder to climb. Sophie did not say thank you. She did not hug me. She simply closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and then opened them again. The fear was gone. The calculation was back. She cashed the bonds the next morning. She did not buy a car. She did not buy clothes. She paid the server bill for the next 12 months in advance. She hired a freelancer to fix the user interface. She took the rejection from the county and used it to make the system undeniable. 3 months later, the phone rang. I was in the kitchen making tea. Sophie was in the living room. I heard her pick up. I heard her say hello. Then I heard silence. I turned around. Sophie was standing up. She was holding the phone with both hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a light I had never seen before. She hung up the phone and looked at me. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of someone who has just jumped off a cliff and realized they can fly. "Mom," she said. That was a venture capital firm from Northern Virginia. She took a step toward me. They saw the beta data from the storm last week. She said, "They want to fly down. They are talking about a seed round." She paused, and a smile broke across her face. A real, genuine smile that made her look like the little girl she used to be before the world tried to crush her. "They are offering $2 million for 10%, she said. I dropped the spoon I was holding. It clattered onto the floor, loud and sharp. $2 million. My daughter. The girl my father said was not worth investing in. The girl my brother laughed at had just built something out of thin air and grit that was worth $20 million. She walked over and hugged me. It was a fierce, desperate hug. "I think I can do this. Mom," she whispered into my shoulder. "I think I can really do this." I held her tight. I looked over her shoulder at the humming servers and the cheap furniture and the stack of rejection letters she had pinned to the wall as motivation. I knew she could do it. She had already done the hard part. She had survived us. Everything else was just business. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, sandwiched between a utility bill and a flyer for a local pizza place. It was heavy, made of thick, cream-colored cardstock that felt expensive to the touch. The return address was embossed in gold leaf. It was the address of the house on the hill, the fortress where I had not set foot in 12 years. I stood in my kitchen, holding the envelope like it was a loaded weapon. I did not need to open it to know what the script inside looked like. I knew it would be elegant, looping calligraphy. I knew the tone would be imperious and pretending to be welcoming. It was an invitation to a family reconciliation gala. The audacity was breathtaking. After 12 years of silence, after treating us like dead branches cut from a tree, they were summoning us back. There was no apology included, no acknowledgement of the years of struggle, just a date, a time, and a dress code. My first instinct was violent. I wanted to shred it. I wanted to burn it in the sink and wash the ashes down the drain. I wanted to pretend it never arrived so I could go back to the peaceful, quiet life we had built. I walked toward the trash can, my grip tightening on the paper. Wait. Sophie's voice was calm. She was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She was 29 now, and the softness of her teenage years had been replaced by a polished, focused intensity. She was dressed for a meeting, wearing a blazer that cost more than my car used to. She walked over to me and gently took the envelope from my hand. I looked at her, confused. I asked her why she would even touch it. I asked her if she had forgotten what they did to us. She looked at the gold embossing and gave a small, dry smile. She said she had not forgotten a single thing. She said she remembered the wine on my shirt. She remembered the look on Bryce's face. She remembered the silence. Then she looked at me. She said that this time, we were going. I felt a surge of panic. I asked her if she was looking for an apology. I told her that men like Walter Hughes do not apologize. They only reload. I told her that if she went back there expecting them to weep and ask for forgiveness, she was going to be destroyed all over again. Sophie shook her head. She walked over to the dining table and placed the invitation down. Then she reached for her briefcase. It was black leather, understated and serious. She set it on the table and clicked the latches open. She told me she did not want an apology. An apology is just words. She said, she told me she wanted closure. And she wanted to close the book on her own terms. She pulled a thick stack of documents from the briefcase and slid them toward me. The cover page read, "The Evelyn Hart Initiative." I looked at her. I asked what this was. She sat down and folded her hands. She explained that for the last 6 months, she had been working with a legal team to structure a new nonprofit foundation. It was fully funded by the profits from her company. Bayshield. The mission was specific. It was a scholarship and vocational training program designed exclusively for women who had been financially abandoned. Women who were restarting their lives after divorce, displacement, or family estrangement. It provided housing, tuition, and childcare. I touched the paper. It was named after my grandmother. Sophie leaned forward. Her eyes were intense. She told me that Grandmother Evelyn did not leave her that money so she could become better than them. She left it so Sophie could be different from them. She said that if she took her wealth and just hoarded it, or used it to buy a bigger house and better cars, she would just be a female version of Bryce. She would just be another Hughes. She said she was going back to that house to announce this initiative. She was going to launch a program that saved women like us, and she was going to do it standing on the lawn of the man who tried to destroy us. But there was more. Sophie pulled another file from the briefcase. This one looked different. It was a standard manila folder, filled with photocopies and public records. She asked me if I knew how Tessa was doing. I admitted I did not. I assumed she was still the same, living in the shadow of the men, drinking too much wine and making snide comments. Sophie opened the file. She had done her due diligence. She had treated the family reunion not as a party, but as a business merger. She had investigated the counterparty. She told me that Tessa was separated from her husband. She told me that Tessa had been quietly selling off her jewelry for the past year. She was living in a rented condo near the airport and was deeply in debt. The family, my father and Bryce, had cut her off because her husband had embarrassed them with a bad business deal. Tessa was the new outcast. She was exactly where I had been 12 years ago, only she did not have a nursing degree or a grandmother's secret trust to save her. I felt a pang of pity, followed by a surge of anger. They ate their own. It did not matter how loyal you were. If you stopped being an asset, you became a liability. Then Sophie slid the final document across the table. It was a title search on the Hughes family estate, the house on the hill, the symbol of the dynasty. I looked at the numbers. They were staggering. Sophie pointed to the bottom line. She explained that on the surface, the family looked as rich as ever, but underneath, the foundation was rotted through. My father had leveraged the house to cover Bryce's bad investments. He had taken out multiple equity lines of credit. The interest payments were eating them alive. The house, the throne, the Museum of Achievements, was technically owned by the bank. They were one bad quarter away from foreclosure. That is why they invited us. Sophie said, they did not invite us because they miss us. They invited us because they read the news. They know Bayshield is valued at over $200 million. They know I am liquid. They are looking for a bailout. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where we had lived for the last decade. She told me that we were going to go. She told me that I was not to say a word. She asked me to promise her that I would stand next to her, hold my head up, and let her do the talking. She said I had done the fighting for 18 years. She said I had taken the hits and the wine stains and the insults. Now, she said, it was her turn. I looked at my daughter. She was terrifyingly calm. She was not going back to burn the house down with a torch. She was going back to buy the mortgage and evict the ghosts. I looked at the invitation again. The gold leaf seemed less intimidating now. It looked desperate. It looked like a plea from a drowning king. I stood up and smoothed the front of my scrub top. I told her I would go. I told her I would stand beside her. Sophie nodded. She closed the briefcase with a solid, final click. She said to get ready. She said we were going to rent a helicopter. I asked her why a helicopter. It seemed flashy. Unlike her, she looked at me with a glint of steel in her eyes. She said that when you enter a room full of predators, you do not walk in through the door like a guest. You descend from above like a force of nature. You make sure that before you even say a word, they know that the hierarchy has changed. We were going back. But we were not returning as the daughter and the granddaughter. We were returning as the judge and the jury. I arrived at the estate 30 minutes before the scheduled time. I drove my sensible sedan up the winding driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my tires with a familiar sound, but the sight that greeted me was different. Memory paints things in gold, but reality was painting this house in shades of gray decay. The pristine white fences I remembered were dull and spotting with mildew. The grass, usually manicured to the millimeter, was uneven, with patches of clover invading the expensive fescue. There were hairline cracks in the masonry of the front porch that had been painted over but not repaired. The house was like an aging beauty queen who had run out of money for surgery. It was trying desperately to hold on to an illusion of grandeur that it could no longer afford. I stepped out of the car and smoothed my dress. I walked around the side of the house to the patio where the guests were gathering. It was the same cast of characters, just older, heavier, and more tired. I saw my brother, Bryce. He was standing near the bar, and he had changed. The athletic arrogance of his youth had curdled into a soft, nervous bulk. His suit was expensive, but it was too tight across the shoulders and the gut, straining at the buttons as if his body was trying to escape the fabric. He was sweating. Despite the mild weather, he was talking to a local councilman, laughing too loud, his eyes darting around the lawn as if he were expecting a process server to jump out of the bushes. His wife stood next to him, draped in jewelry that looked heavy enough to sink a ship. She was smiling, but it was a brittle, porcelain smile. Her eyes were terrified. Then I saw Landon, the golden boy, the investment, the reason for my daughter's exile. He was standing in the far corner of the patio, half hidden by a decorative pillar. He did not look like a savior. He looked like a fugitive. He was thin, gaunt even, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and chemical coping mechanisms. He was holding a glass of water with both hands, his knuckles white. He looked like a man who wanted to unzip his own skin and step out of it, just to escape the weight of the name tag on his chest. And there, in the center of it all, was my father. Walter Hughes sat in his wheelchair, an oxygen cannula running under his nose. He was frail, his skin papery and translucent, but he was still trying to command the room. He sat with his chin up, his hands gripping the armrests, barking orders at a waiter. He was a king on a crumbling throne, ruling over a kingdom of debt and disappointment. He saw me approach. He did not smile. He just nodded, a curt acknowledgement of a subject returning to the fold. "You are late," he wheezed. I was not late. I was early. But Walter Hughes did not own a clock. He owned the time. I did not answer him. I just took my place at the edge of the patio and waited. The sound started as a distant thrum, a vibration in the air that made the crystal glasses on the tables shiver. The conversation died down. People looked up at the sky, shielding their eyes against the sun. The thrum grew into a roar, a rhythmic, percussive beating that drowned out the polite jazz music playing from the speakers. The wind hit us first. It swept across the lawn, flattening the unruly grass and sending napkins flying like white doves. The guests scrambled, clutching their hats and their drinks. The waiter dropped a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The black helicopter banked sharply over the tree line and descended. It was an aggressive machine, sleek and predatory. It hovered for a moment, the rotor wash kicking up a storm of leaves and debris, before settling onto the center of the lawn with a heavy, mechanical grace. The engine began to wind down, the whine dropping in pitch. The door opened. Sophie stepped out. She did not look like the girl who had left 12 years ago. She wore a charcoal suit that was tailored to within an inch of its life. She wore no jewelry. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. She did not look around with wonder or nostalgia. She looked around with the cool, detached assessment of an auditor coming to inspect the books. She walked across the grass toward the patio. She did not rush. Every step was measured. Every step was an assertion of ownership. My father pushed himself up from his wheelchair. His hands shook, and his knees wobbled. But he forced himself to stand. He spread his arms wide, a beaming, benevolent smile plastering itself across his face. He was putting on a show. He was playing the part of the forgiving patriarch welcoming the prodigal child. "Sophie, my dear," he called out, his voice thin and reedy. "You have come home." He moved to hug her. He wanted to wrap his arms around her, to claim her success, to absorb her into the Hughes collective. Sophie stopped. She was 3 feet away from him. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She simply took one deliberate half-step backward. It was a small movement, but it hit the crowd like a slap in the face. It was a rejection so absolute, so physical, that my father froze with his arms still open, looking like a statue that had been toppled. "I am not here for a hug." "Walter," Sophie said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent patio. My father's smile faltered. He lowered his arms slowly. "Now, Sophie," he stammered, "let us not be dramatic. We are family." Sophie looked at him, then she looked at Bryce, and finally, she looked at the crowd of onlookers who were watching with bated breath. "My name is Sophie Hughes," she said. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Bayshield Analytics. My company is currently valued at $200 million. She stated the number as if she were reading a zip code. There was no pride in it, no arrogance. It was just a data point. A gasp went through the crowd. Bryce went pale. My mother put a hand to her throat. Sophie turned back to my father. 12 years ago, on this exact patio, you told my mother that investing in my education would be a waste of capital. You said that money spent on a girl creates zero return." My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked smaller now, shrinking under the weight of her gaze. "I am here to tell you that you were wrong," Sophie said, "but I am not here to prove it to you. I do not need you to understand my value. I am here because I understand yours." The silence was total. You could hear the wind rustling the leaves in the oak trees. Sophie turned her head slowly and looked at the corner of the patio. She looked at Landon. My nephew flinched. He looked like he wanted to dissolve into the brickwork. He was terrified that she was going to mock him. He was terrified that she was going to compare her millions to his failures, her empire to his emptiness. Sophie walked over to him. She stopped a few feet away. Her expression softened. The steel left her eyes, replaced by something that looked painfully like pity. "Landon," she said quietly. He looked up at her, his eyes wet. "I did not come here to shame you," she said. "I know what they did to you. I know they put a crown on your head before you could even walk, and I know how heavy that gold can be." Landon let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "I am here to tell you the truth," she continued. "You are not a genius. You are not a savior. You are just a person, and that is fine." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a plain white business card. She placed it on the table next to his trembling hand. "If you want to get out of this play they have written for you, call that number," she said. "I can give you a door, but you have to be the one to walk through it." She turned back to the center of the room. The air was electric. My father was slumped in his chair, gasping for air, the tubes in his nose vibrating. Bryce was staring at the floor. Sophie walked over to me. She stood next to me, shoulder to shoulder. She did not take my hand, but she stood close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her. We were a front. We were a wall. She looked at the assembly of guests, at the crumbling house, at the terrified men who had once been giants. "Now," she said, her voice hard again, "we need to talk about the mortgage." My father looked like he had been struck by lightning. The word mortgage hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, but Sophie did not give him time to recover. She did not give any of them time to retreat into their usual defenses of denial and arrogance. She signaled to the pilot who was standing by the helicopter, and he handed her a heavy box of brochures. She placed the stack on the table, right next to the untouched hors d'oeuvres. "This is the Evelyn Hart Initiative," Sophie announced. Her voice was clear, projecting to the back of the lawn where the curious neighbors were undoubtedly listening from their porches. "It is a fully funded comprehensive support system. We provide full tuition scholarships, subsidized housing, and vocational training for women who have been displaced, abandoned, or financially abused by their families." She looked at my mother, who was clutching her pearl necklace as if it were a rosary. "It is for women who were told they were bad investments," Sophie said. "It is for the side branches that the trunks tried to prune away." Then she turned back to Landon. The boy was still staring at the business card she had given him. "Trembling, and it is not just for women," she said. "We have a pilot program for career redirection. It is for young men who were forced into boxes that did not fit them." She looked Landon in the eye. "If you want it," she said, "there is a spot for you. But I need to be clear about the terms. It is not a consulting gig. You will not be a vice president. You will start at the bottom. You will learn to write code, or manage logistics, or analyze data. You will work 40 hours a week. You will clock in. You will clock out. And for the first time in your life, you will sleep at night because you will be tired from work. Not from carrying the weight of a lie." Bryce stepped forward. His face was a mask of fury. The shame of seeing his son offered an entry-level job by the niece he had mocked was too much for his fragile ego. "Who do you think you are?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You think because you got lucky with some computer program you have the right to come here and lecture us? You have no right to teach us about life. You are a guest on this property." Sophie did not raise her voice. She did not get angry. She looked at him with a calm, terrifying indifference. "I have the right of a person who does not need you," she said, "and that makes me the most powerful person in this zip code." Bryce opened his mouth to scream something else, but the sound of gravel crunching under tires stopped him. A silver SUV had pulled through the open gates. It was not a luxury car. It was a domestic model, a few years old, with a dent in the rear bumper and dust on the wheel wells. It looked out of place among the pristine vintage cars parked in the driveway. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. She was thin, painfully so. Her hair, once dyed a vibrant blonde, was now dull and pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore a simple pair of gray slacks and a white button-down shirt that looked like it had been ironed by hand in a hurry. It took me a full 5 seconds to realize I was looking at my sister. Tessa walked toward the patio. She did not walk with the sway she used to have. She walked with her head down, her shoulders hunched, clutching a purse to her chest like a shield. The silence on the patio changed. It went from tense to confused. "Tessa?" my mother whispered. Tessa stopped at the edge of the stone pavers. She looked at my father, then at Bryce, and finally at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She looked exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually. She looked like a woman who had been running for a very long time and had finally hit a wall. "I called you," she said. Her voice was raspy. She looked at Bryce. "I called you 6 months ago. Bryce, when Mark left, when the bank took the condo. I left 3 voicemails." Bryce looked away, pretending to be fascinated by a spot on the tablecloth. "I called you. Dad," she said, turning to Walter. "I told the nurse it was an emergency. I told her I had nowhere to go. She said you were in a meeting about Landon's future. She said you could not be disturbed." My father stared at her, his mouth slightly open. He did not deny it. He simply looked annoyed that his failure was being broadcast. Sophie walked over to Tessa. She did not hug her immediately. She reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a thick file folder. She placed it gently into Tessa's hands. "We heard you," Sophie said softly. Tessa looked down at the folder. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a lease agreement for a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood. There was an enrollment form for a paralegal certification program, something Tessa had talked about doing 20 years ago before the family told her it was too common. And there was a check, not for $1 million, but for enough to buy groceries and furniture for 6 months. Tessa looked up at Sophie, tears spilling over her cheeks. Then she looked at me. She took a step toward me. The arrogance was gone. The cruelty that had led her to pour wine on me 12 years ago had been burned away by hardship. "Paisley," she choked out, "I am so sorry." She was weeping now, ugly, gasping sobs. "I am so sorry about what I did. I was so scared back then. I thought if I pushed you down, they would not come for me. But they came for me anyway." She reached out as if to touch my arm, then pulled back, unworthy. "Please forgive me," she whispered. I looked at my sister. I saw the lines on her face. I saw the cheap shoes. I felt a tug in my heart. The old instinct to smooth things over, to say it was okay. But I did not say it was okay. It was not okay. I stepped closer to her. I put my hand on her shoulder. It was a firm grip, not a caress. "Do not apologize to make yourself feel lighter." "Tessa," I said, "I do not want your guilt. Guilt is useless." I pointed to the folder in her hands. "You take that, and you use it. You wake up early, you study hard. You build a life that is actually yours so you never have to beg these people for a seat at the table again. You do not owe me an apology. You owe yourself a spine." Tessa nodded, swallowing hard. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She stood up a little straighter. My father let out a sound that was half gasp, half groan. He collapsed back into his wheelchair. It was not a medical event. It was the sound of a man watching his entire worldview disintegrate. He had spent his life believing that money and fear were the only things that held a family together. He believed that women were weak and needed to be controlled. Now, in front of his friends and neighbors, the women he had discarded were standing tall, funded by their own competence, while his chosen heirs were crumbling. The hierarchy was inverted. The structure was gone. The guests were whispering now, a low buzz of scandal that would fuel the Annapolis gossip mill for a decade. Sophie turned away from Tessa and walked back to the head of the table. She stood directly in front of my father. She loomed over him, blocking out the sun. She looked down at him with an expression that was almost clinical. "I did not come here just to hand out scholarships, grandfather," she said. "And I did not come here just to save Tessa and Landon from the wreckage you created." My father looked up at her, his eyes watery and fearful. "What do you want?" he wheezed. Sophie placed her hands flat on the table. She leaned in close. "I came here to settle the books," she said. She paused, letting the tension ratchet up until it was unbearable. "I know about the loan," she said. My father went gray. "I know about the collateralized debt obligation you signed 3 years ago to cover Bryce's losses in the futures market." She continued, "I know that you put this house up as security, and I know that the note is due in 14 days. She tapped her finger on the table. "You are not just cash poor, Walter, you are underwater, and the sharks are circling." Sophie opened the blue folder that had been sitting under her hand. She did not slide it across the table this time. She opened it and began to read, her voice devoid of emotion, like a judge reading a verdict that had been decided months ago. She detailed the structure of the loans my father had taken out. She listed the dates, the interest rates, and the balloon payments that were impossible to meet. She explained that the bank had already initiated foreclosure proceedings. This party, this desperate display of wealth, was the last gasp of a drowning man trying to convince his creditors that he could still swim. My father did not speak. He stared at the tablecloth, his chest heaving. The illusion was gone. The neighbors heard it. The staff heard it. The family heard it. The Hughes dynasty was insolvent. Then came the turn that made the heir leave the room. Sophie turned a page. "You are right about the sharks, grandfather," she said. "The bank was preparing to sell this debt to a collection agency that specializes in liquidating distressed assets. They were going to seize the house, auction off the furniture, and put you on the street in 30 days. She paused. I stopped them. Bryce looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He thought she had paid it off. He thought she was going to write a check and save them, just like they always expected the women to do. I bought the debt, Sophie said. The silence that followed was heavier than the helicopter. I purchased the note through a holding company this morning. She continued, I am the sole creditor of the Hughes estate. You do not owe the bank any more. Walter, you owe me. Bryce jumped to his feet. He knocked his chair over. You are stealing our house, he screamed. You planned this. You came here to rob us of our inheritance. Sophie looked at him calmly. There is no inheritance. Bryce, she said, there is only a negative balance. If I had not stepped in, you would be evicted by next month. I did not steal the house. I caught it before it hit the ground. She turned back to my father. She placed a single document in front of him. It was not a check. It was a contract. I am not going to foreclose on you, she said. I am offering you a choice. She tapped the paper. You will sign over the title of this estate to the Evelyn Hart Initiative. The house will be converted into the headquarters for the foundation. The upper floors will be renovated into temporary housing for the scholarship recipients. The grounds will be used for vocational training events. My mother gasped. But where will we live? She whispered. Sophie's expression softened. Just a fraction. There is a clause, she said. You and grandmother have a life estate in the guest cottage at the back of the property. All your medical expenses will be covered. You will be comfortable. You will be safe. But you will not be the lords of the manor anymore. You will be guests in a house dedicated to the people you despised. My father looked at the contract. His hands were shaking so badly that the papers rustled. He looked at the brick walls he had built his identity around. He looked at the lawn where he had banished me 12 years ago. This is my legacy, he choked out. No, Sophie said firmly. This house is just a pile of bricks. Your legacy is sitting right there. She pointed at Landon, who was still clutching the business card she had given him. She pointed at Tessa, who was reading the lease agreement for her new apartment. And she pointed at me. My father looked at me. For the first time in my life, he really looked at me. His eyes traveled down to my wrist. He looked at the battered, cheap analog watch that had belonged to his mother-in-law, the watch he had called garbage, the watch that had ticked through 12 years of poverty and dignity. He let out a long, rattling sigh. The fight went out of him. He did not look angry anymore. He just looked old. Evelyn, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. She always looked further down the road than I did. He picked up the pen. He did not apologize to me. He did not tell me he loved me. Men like Walter Hughes do not have that kind of language in their vocabulary. But when he signed his name on the line, surrendering his kingdom to the granddaughter he had rejected, it was an admission of defeat more powerful than any apology. He capped the pen and pushed the paper toward Sophie. It is done, he said. Sophie took the paper. She checked the signature. She nodded once. Thank you, she said. She did not gloat. She did not do a victory lap. She simply closed the folder, signaling that the transaction was complete. The Hughes estate was no longer a monument to male ego. It was now a fortress for women who needed a second chance. The aftermath of that afternoon was not a fairy tale. It was real life, messy and slow, but it was moving in the right direction. Tessa moved into the apartment Sophie paid for. She finished the paralegal program in 18 months. She works for a firm in the city now. She is not rich, but she pays her own bills, and she comes to Sunday dinner at my house every week. We are learning to be sisters again. Landon did not take the job immediately. His ego was too bruised. He tried to make it on his own for another year, failed spectacularly, and hit rock bottom. Only then did he call the number on the card. Sophie hired him. She started him in the mailroom, last I heard. He was working in data entry, and for the first time in his life, he looks happy. He looks like a person, not a project. Bryce and his wife divorced 6 months after the party. He moved to Florida. We do not speak much. Some bridges are too burned to be rebuilt, and that is okay. As for me, Sophie had one last surprise. A week after the confrontation, She drove me to a small street about 20 minutes from the city. It was not a mansion. It was a cottage with yellow siding and a wraparound porch. The garden was overgrown with wildflowers, and there was a big oak tree in the back. She handed me a set of keys. "I did not buy you a palace." "Mom," she said, "palaces are cold. I bought you a home." I stood on the porch and listened to the birds. I looked at my daughter, the CEO, the visionary, the woman who had rewritten our history with a pen made of steel. I realized then that the money did not matter. The house did not matter. What mattered was that we were standing there, on our own 2 feet, owing nothing to anyone. So, here is the message I want to leave you with. You cannot force people to see your value. You cannot beg for respect from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You can scream, you can cry, you can show them your degrees and your accomplishments. But if they are looking at you through a lens of prejudice, they will never see you. Do not waste your life trying to convince them. Do not wait for an inheritance that comes with strings attached. Take your cheap watch, take your dignity, and walk away. Leave the table where you are treated like a side dish. Go out into the cold and build your own kitchen. It will be hard. It will be lonely. You will eat a lot of beans and rice, but one day, you will look up and realize that the table you built is the only one worth sitting at, and the people who truly belong there will find you. My name is Paisley Hughes. I was the invisible daughter. Now, I am the mother of a revolution, and I have never slept better in my life. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey, and I hope it resonated with some of you out there who are fighting your own battles for recognition and respect. I would love to know where you are listening from. Drop a comment below with your city or country, and let's get a conversation going about how you handle difficult family dynamics. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice and resilience, please make sure to subscribe to the Morgan Revenge Stories channel. Hit that like button to support the work, and smash the hype button so this video can reach more people who might need to hear this message today. Stay strong, and remember, your value is non-negotiable.